My name is Douglas Mercer. I'm a high school history teacher, 42 years old and recently divorced. To be honest, life hasn't been great lately. My son, Tyler, barely talks to me anymore. He's 16, angry, rebellious, and blames me for everything that went wrong in our family. I don't blame him. I wasn't around much when he needed me most. This trip was supposed to fix that, or at least start to. I thought maybe a few days in the woods would give us a chance to reconnect. Fresh air, campfires, no distractions, just us. So, I rented an old RV, a 1976 Winnebago Brave, and invited my childhood friend Hank and his wife Marlene to join us. Hank's an outdoorsman, the kind of guy who knows how to survive in the wilderness. I figured he'd help keep things running smoothly. We decided on Shawnee National Forest in Illinois. Hank recommended it, said it was beautiful this time of year. But when we got there, things didn't go as planned. The first sign something was off came when we arrived at the campsite. I had reserved a spot weeks ago, but the ranger at the office told us our reservation had been canceled. No explanation, just canceled. The only site left was in a place called Hungry Hollow. Hungry Hollow? I asked. The ranger shrugged. Locals call it that. It's remote, quiet, but folks don't usually camp there. Why not? Hank asked. The ranger hesitated before answering. People say it's unlucky. I laughed it off at the time. Unlucky? What did that even mean? But looking back now, I wish we'd turned around and gone home right then and there. The drive to Hungry Hollow took us deep into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. By the time we reached the site, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. The campsite itself was strange. There was a dried-up riverbed nearby, its cracked surface littered with dead leaves and twigs. The trees around us had bark that looked like faces, twisted and hollow-eyed, staring down at us from every angle. Creepy, Tyler muttered under his breath as we parked the RV. Hank laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. That's just your imagination, kid. But even Hank seemed uneasy as we set up camp. That night, Sheriff Roy Tanner stopped by to check on us. He was an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes. "You folks planning to stay here long?" he asked. "Just a few days," I replied. He nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. "Be careful out here," he said after a pause. "We've had some hikers go missing recently." "What happened to them?" Marlene asked. "Probably got lost," he said quickly, but his tone didn't match his words. "Just stick close to camp and don't wander too far." With that, he tipped his hat and left without another word. That night was when things really started to feel wrong. We all went to bed early after dinner. It had been a long day, but sleep didn't come easy for any of us. The RV creaked and groaned like it was alive, settling into the uneven ground beneath it. The air inside felt heavy and damp, like a storm was coming even though the sky had been clear earlier. And then came the dreams. I don't know how else to describe it except to say that all of us, me, Tyler, Hank, and Marlene, dreamed the same thing that night. We were standing in the middle of the woods, surrounded by those twisted trees with their hollow faces carved into the bark. Something was watching us from the shadows, something big and silent with glowing white eyes. I woke, up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. Across from me, Tyler sat up suddenly, gasping for air. "You okay?" I asked him. He shook his head but didn't say anything. In the morning, over coffee and eggs cooked on a portable stove outside the RV, Marlene broke the silence. "I had this awful dream last night," she said quietly. Hank nodded grimly. "Me too. When we compared details, we realized all our dreams were exactly the same." "That's not normal," Tyler said flatly. "No," I agreed. "It's not. But what could we do? Pack up and leave because of some bad dreams? It sounded ridiculous at the time. but maybe we should have listened to our instincts. By mid-morning, Tyler wandered off on his own while Hank showed me how to chop firewood properly. "You're doing it all wrong," he kept saying. When Tyler came back about an hour later, he looked pale and shaken. "What's wrong?" I asked him. He held out his phone to show me a picture he'd taken in the woods, a close-up of a tree trunk with strange symbols carved into it. They looked ancient somehow, like something out of an old history book about Native American tribes or ancient rituals. "Where did you find this?" Marlene asked him. "Over there," he said, pointing toward a cluster of trees near the dried-up riverbed. Hank frowned as he studied the photo on Tyler's phone. "I've been coming here for years," he said slowly. "I've never seen anything like this before. None of us knew what to make of it. But deep down, I think we all felt it. Something wasn't right about Hungry Hollow. That night was worse than the first. The RV felt colder than it should have been, even with all the windows shut, tight. And there was this smell, faint but persistent, like rotting leaves mixed with something metallic. Coppery. None of us slept well again that night, not after hearing faint whispers outside that sounded like our names being called from somewhere deep in the woods. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was pounding and my chest felt heavy, like something was sitting on me all night. Tyler looked just as bad, dark circles under his eyes, his face pale. Hank and Marlene weren't much better. None of us said anything about the whispers. We'd heard outside the RV, but I could tell we were all thinking about it. We stepped outside to get some fresh air, and that's when we noticed something strange. The RV wasn't where we had parked it. It had moved, about 50 feet closer to the dried-up riverbed. "What the hell?" Hank muttered, walking around the vehicle like he was looking for an explanation. "Did someone move it during the night?" Marlene asked. "No way," I said firmly. "I locked the doors before we went to bed and we would have heard the engine if someone started it." Hank checked the ground around the RV for tire tracks but found nothing. It was like the RV had just slid across the dirt on its own. Tyler stared at it for a long time before saying quietly, "Something's wrong here." Later that day, Marlene decided to clean out the glove compartment of the RV while Hank and I fixed a loose hinge on one of the closet doors. She called us over after finding something unusual, a stack of old newspaper clippings shoved in the back of the compartment. "Look at this," she said, spreading them out on the tiny dining table inside the RV. The articles were all about a family that had gone missing in this area back in 1952. A couple and their 2 kids had been camping in Shawnee National Forest when they disappeared without a trace. Search teams found their campsite abandoned and their car still parked nearby, but there was no sign of them anywhere. "What happened to them?" Tyler asked. "No one knows," Marlene said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The articles say there were rumors about strange things happening in this part of the forest, but nothing concrete." I glanced at Hank, who was staring out the window toward the woods with a grim expression. "You ever hear about this before?" I asked. "Him?" He shook his head slowly. "No, but I'm starting to think we should have picked a different campsite." That afternoon, Tyler wandered off again while Hank tried to fix a leak in one of the RV's water pipes. When Tyler came back, he wasn't alone. He had brought someone with him, a local kid named Eddie. Eddie looked about 17 or 18, with shaggy blonde hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had this odd smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is Eddie," Tyler said awkwardly. "He lives nearby." Eddie nodded at us but didn't say much at first. When Marlene asked him if he knew anything about Hungry Hollow, his smile faded. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. "What do you mean?" Hank asked. Eddie glanced toward the woods like he was afraid someone, or something, might be watching him. "The Hollow Men hunt during the full moon," he said quietly. "What are you talking about?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the dried-up riverbed and said, "Stay away from there after dark." Before any of us could ask him more questions, Eddie turned and walked off into the woods without another word. That night was colder than any October night I'd ever experienced before. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like winter had arrived overnight. We lit a fire outside to keep warm and sat around it in silence for a while, listening to the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. Hank broke out his flask at some point and started drinking heavily, more than usual. He kept glancing toward the woods like he was expecting something to come out of them. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly, his voice slurred. "Hear what?" Marlene replied nervously. "My name," Hank said, staring into the darkness beyond, our campsite. "Someone's calling my name." None of us heard anything except for the wind, but Hank swore he could hear it, soft whispers floating through the air, calling to him over and over again. When we finally went back inside the RV for the night, things got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound outside, like soft footsteps crunching through dead leaves. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal wandering near our campsite, but then I heard something else. Breathing. Slow and steady breathing coming from right outside my window. I froze in place, too scared to move or even look outside. The breathing stopped after a few minutes. But then there was another sound, a faint tapping on one of the windows near Tyler's bunk bed. "Dad," Tyler whispered from across the RV. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, but didn't say anything. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The worst part came just before dawn. We all woke up to find dozens of deer standing around our campsite, perfectly still and completely silent. They were all facing the RV, their cloudy white eyes staring directly at us through every window. "What? What is this?" Marlene stammered as she peeked through one of the curtains. None of us could answer her because none of us understood what we were seeing, or why it was happening. Hank stepped outside cautiously with a flashlight in hand to get a closer look at them. But as soon as he did, every single deer turned its head toward him at exactly the same time. He stumbled backward into the RV, slamming the door shut behind him. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." The deer were gone by morning, but none of us felt relieved. If anything, their sudden disappearance made things worse. It was like they had just vanished into thin air, leaving no tracks behind. Hank didn't say much as he packed up the firewood and checked the RV's engine. He looked pale, his hands shaking slightly. "We should leave," he muttered under his breath. I wanted to agree with him, but something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness or pride. I didn't want to admit that I'd made a mistake bringing us here. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper that I couldn't explain. Later that morning, Marlene went to gather firewood while Hank and I tried to figure out why the RV's radio kept turning on by itself. It was an old model, and every time it powered up, it only played static or strange snippets of old broadcasts from the 1940s. Voices talking about war rations and victory gardens. "Probably just a wiring issue," Hank said, though he didn't sound convinced. Tyler stayed inside the RV, scrolling through his phone and ignoring us. He hadn't said much since the deer incident, and I could tell he was scared, even if he didn't want to admit it. About an hour later, Marlene still hadn't come back. At first, we thought she might have wandered farther than she meant to. Hank grabbed his flashlight and started calling her name, his voice echoing through the trees. But there was no answer, just silence. "Maybe she went back to the riverbed," Tyler suggested hesitantly. Hank shook his head. "She wouldn't go there alone." We searched for her for what felt like hours, calling her name over and over, again until our voices were hoarse. Eventually, we found one of her boots lying in the dirt near a cluster of trees. There was no sign of her anywhere, except for a trail of strange footprints leading deeper into the woods. They weren't human footprints, not even close. Each one had 3 long toes with sharp claw marks at the end. The sight of them sent chills down my spine. "What is this?" I whispered. Hank didn't answer me. He just stared at the footprints like he was trying to make sense of them. And failing. By the time we got back to camp, Hank was acting different. He kept muttering to himself under his breath, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "She's still here," he said suddenly, stopping in front of me and Tyler. "I can feel it." "What are you talking about?" I asked him. "She's wearing something else now," he replied cryptically before walking off toward the woods again. I didn't know what he meant by that, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. That night, Tyler and I decided to search for Marlene ourselves while Hank stayed behind at camp. We figured we'd check out the riverbed since it seemed like the most likely place she might have gone. When we got there, we found something that made my stomach turn. A hidden cave entrance partially covered by dead leaves and branches. The opening was small, just big enough for someone to crawl through, and the walls inside were covered in strange symbols like the ones Tyler had photographed earlier. Fresh blood streaked across some of the symbols, dripping down onto the dirt. Floor below. "I don't think we should be here," Tyler whispered nervously. I nodded, but couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. Something about the cave felt important, like it held answers we needed to find Marlene, or at least understand what was happening in Hungry Hollow. As we crawled deeper into the cave, we found old journals scattered across the ground, pages torn and yellowed with age. Most of them were unreadable, but one entry stood out. "The hunger wears their faces now. It takes their skin and walks among us." I stared at those words for what felt like forever before turning to Tyler. "What does that mean?" I asked him. He shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but I think Eddie does." When we got back to camp, Sheriff Tanner was waiting for us near the RV. He looked calm, too calm, and asked us strange questions about our sleeping habits. Did we sleep soundly? Did anyone wake up during the night? "Why are you asking this?" I demanded. He smiled faintly but didn't answer me directly. Instead, he said something that sent chills down my spine. "Be careful who you trust out here." Before leaving, Tanner glanced at Hank, who was sitting by the fire with his flask, and said quietly, "You should keep an eye on him." That night was worse than any night before it. Around midnight, Tyler woke me up in a panic. "Dad," he whispered urgently. "The RV, it's moving." I jumped out of bed and looked outside just in time to see the RV's engine start on its own, its headlights flickering as it began rolling toward the woods with Tyler still inside. "Tyler!" I shouted as I ran after it, my heart pounding, in my chest. The RV stopped suddenly just before reaching the tree line, its tires skidding in place like something had grabbed hold of it and forced it to stop. When I opened the door to get Tyler out, he looked pale and shaken, but unharmed. "It wasn't me," he said quickly before I could ask him anything. "I didn't touch anything." I believed him, because deep down, I knew something else had been driving that RV, and whatever it was wasn't human. The next morning, I woke up to find Hank sitting by the fire staring into the flames like he wasn't really there. His face looked wrong. His skin seemed stretched too tight across his cheekbones and his eyes were sunken, almost hollow. "Hank?" I called out softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he started mumbling something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. It sounded like another language, but it wasn't one I'd ever heard before. His voice was low and raspy, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him. Tyler stepped out of the RV and froze when he saw Hank. "Dad, what's wrong with him?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but something's not right." As the day went on, Hank's behavior got worse. He kept wandering off into the woods and coming back with scratches on his arms and dirt smeared across his clothes. Each time he returned, he looked less like himself, his movements jerky, his voice slurred. "He's not Hank anymore," Tyler whispered to me at one point. "I don't think he's even human." I wanted to argue with him, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever had happened to Hank, it wasn't natural. While Hank was off in the woods again, Tyler and I decided to check out the cave one last time. Something about it felt important, like it held answers we needed to survive. Inside the cave, we found more journals scattered across the ground. One of them had a drawing of a creature that made my blood run cold. A pale, emaciated humanoid, with elongated limbs and a mouth that opened in 4 directions. The caption beneath it read, "The hunger takes what it wants." "This is what Eddie was talking about," Tyler said quietly. "The Hollow Men." I nodded, but didn't say anything. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The symbols on the trees, the footprints in the dirt, Hank's strange behavior, and now, this creature. As we explored deeper into the cave, we found more symbols carved into the walls. Symbols that matched the ones Tyler had photographed earlier. Some of them were fresh, like someone, or something, had carved them recently. At the very back of the cave, we found something else, a pile of bones. They were small, like they belonged to animals, but they were arranged in a circle around. A charred piece of wood that looked like it had been burned in a ritual. "This isn't normal," Tyler said nervously. "No," I agreed. "It's not." When we got back to camp, Sheriff Tanner was waiting for us again. This time, he didn't look calm or collected. He looked angry. "Why did you go into the cave?" he demanded. "How do you know we went there?" I asked him. He didn't answer me directly. Instead, he stepped closer and said something that sent chills down my spine. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" "What are you talking about?" Tyler asked. Tanner smiled faintly but didn't say anything else. As he turned to leave, I noticed something strange. His shadow didn't match his body. It moved independently, stretching and twisting across the ground like it had a mind of its own. That night was when everything fell apart. Around midnight, Hank came back to camp looking worse than ever. His skin was pale and stretched so tightly across his face that it looked like it might tear at any moment. His eyes were completely white, cloudy and lifeless, and his movements were jerky, almost mechanical. "Hank?" Marlene called out hesitantly as she stepped out of the RV. He turned toward her slowly and smiled, a twisted grin that sent shivers down my spine. "You're not Hank," I said firmly. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to him, and stepped closer to Marlene. "She's mine now," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. Before any of us could stop him, he lunged at Marlene with unnatural speed, and she screamed as his hands wrapped around her throat. Tyler grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it at Hank with all his strength, knocking him backward into the dirt. "Run!" he shouted at Marlene as she gasped for air. We all ran toward the RV as Hank, or whatever was wearing his skin, got back up and started chasing us with jerky movements that didn't look human. When we got inside the RV and locked the doors behind us, we thought we were safe. But then we heard more footsteps outside, dozens of them, all moving toward us from every direction. Through the windows we saw figures emerging from the woods, figures that looked like people but moved like puppets on strings. Their faces were pale and stretched tightly across their skulls, their mouths twisted into unnatural grins. "They're not real," Tyler whispered as he stared out the window in horror. "They're just wearing people." As the figures surrounded the RV, we realized there was only one way out: fire. I grabbed a canister of gasoline from under one of the seats and poured it in a circle around the RV while Tyler held a lighter in his trembling hands. "Are you sure this will work?" he asked me nervously. "No," I admitted honestly, "but it's our only chance." As soon as Tyler lit the fire, the figures screamed, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the woods and stumbled backward away from the flames. But then we saw something else. A pale creature emerging from behind them with elongated limbs and glowing white eyes. The hunger itself. The fire burned bright, casting flickering shadows across the woods. The figures around the RV screamed and writhed, their pale faces twisting in pain as they stumbled away from the flames. But the creature, the real thing, the hunger, didn't stop. It stepped closer, its long limbs moving unnaturally, its glowing white eyes locked on us. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with skin so pale it looked like it had never seen sunlight. Its mouth opened in 4 directions, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glistened in the firelight. And then, it spoke, not with words, but with voices. All the voices we'd heard in the woods, the whispers, the breathing. It was all coming from this thing. "Leave," it said, its voice layered with dozens of tones. Or, "Stay forever." Tyler grabbed my arm, his voice trembling. "Dad, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get us out of this nightmare. The RV's engine was still running. It had started on its own again, but every time we tried to drive away, the road looped back to Hungry Hollow. "It's keeping us here," I said quietly. Tyler looked at me with wide eyes. "The RV, it's connected to it somehow." I thought about everything we'd seen. The scratches on the closet doors that reappeared when painted over, the static on the radio, the animal bones under the vehicle each morning. The RV wasn't just a vehicle. It was part of whatever was, haunting this place. As the hunger stepped closer to the RV, I remembered something I'd seen in one of the journals back at the cave. An escape symbol carved into a piece of wood. I didn't understand how it worked or why it was important, but I knew it was our only chance. "Tyler," I said urgently, "check under the dashboard. Look for a carving, something that looks like a symbol." He nodded and scrambled to search, while I kept my eyes on the hunger. It was so close now that I could hear its breathing, a deep, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. "I found it!" Tyler shouted after a few tense seconds. The symbol was small and simple, a circle with jagged lines running through it, and it was carved into the underside of the dashboard near the steering wheel. "What do we do?" Tyler asked. I remembered something else from the journal. Blood activates the symbol. Without hesitating, I grabbed a knife from one of the drawers and cut my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the carving. As soon as my blood touched it, the symbol began to glow faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The RV jolted forward suddenly, its tires spinning as if something had pushed it from behind. The road ahead shimmered like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day, and for a moment I thought we were going to crash into some kind of invisible wall. But then we broke through. The woods around us disappeared in an instant, replaced by open fields and clear skies. The air felt lighter, cleaner, and there were no twisted trees or glowing eyes watching us anymore. We had escaped Hungry Hollow, or so we thought. 6 months later, Tyler and I were living in a new town far away from Shawnee National Forest. We didn't talk about what happened, not to each other or anyone else, but it lingered in our minds like a shadow we couldn't shake. One night, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I noticed something strange. 3-toed footprints leading from Tyler's room to the living room carpet. They were faint but unmistakable, and they sent chills down my spine. "Tyler?" I called out nervously. He walked into the room casually but stopped when he saw my face. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the footprints without saying anything. He stared at them for a long moment before looking up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "It's nothing," he said quickly, brushing past me toward his room. But later that night I saw him staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His eyes flashed white for just a second. So fast I almost thought I imagined it. And then he whispered something under his breath. "Hungry Hollow follows those who leave." I froze in place as his shadow stretched unnaturally across the wall behind him, longer and darker than it should have been, and then disappeared when he turned off the light. The next morning, I found a familiar symbol carved into one of our walls, the same escape symbol from under the RV's dashboard, but this time, it wasn't glowing, and then came the radio static, the same sound we'd heard back at Hungry Hollow, faint but persistent, like it was waiting for us to notice it again. My name is Hal Winters. I'm a park ranger, and this year I've been assigned to Deadwood Creek Campground. It's a remote valley in Oregon, surrounded by dead trees and a dried-up creek bed that hasn't seen water in years. My 12-year-old daughter, Ellie, is with me. She's sensitive, artistic, and sometimes sees things I can't. After losing my wife to cancer 2 years ago, it's just the two of us now. Me trying to move on, and Ellie trying to understand what moving on even means. We arrived here last week in our old silver RV, the one I restored with my wife before she got sick. It's a good little home for us, cozy but sturdy. The campground is completely empty because of the drought. No tourists come here anymore, which means it's just me, Ellie, and Rex, our dog. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. Rex wouldn't stop growling at the corner of the RV, where Ellie keeps her art supplies. I thought maybe he smelled a mouse or something, but when I checked, there was nothing there. Ellie didn't seem bothered by Rex's behavior. She just sat at the little table inside the RV and started drawing. She's always been good at drawing, better than most kids her age, but her pictures lately have been strange. That night, she drew a group of children standing among dead trees. Their eyes were black holes, and their faces looked stretched out like they weren't human anymore. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "They're just kids from here." I didn't understand what she meant. The next morning, we met Martin Blackwell. He lives in a cabin near the campground and knows everything about this place, its history, its legends, even its secrets. He's an older guy with a long gray beard and a voice that sounds like gravel crunching under boots. Martin warned me about the creek bed almost right away. "Don't go near it after sunset," he said firmly. "Why not?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. He just looked at Ellie and said something about how children are more sensitive to things adults can't see. That night was worse than the first one. The air outside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. Rex refused to leave the RV altogether and stayed curled up under the table, shaking like a leaf. I heard strange noises outside, branches snapping even though there was no wind, and Ellie whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "The trees are listening." I laughed nervously and told her she had too much imagination for her own good, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. The next morning brought more unsettling discoveries. As I walked around the RV to check on things, I noticed small footprints in the dirt, barefoot prints that looked like they belonged to children. But there were no kids here. There hadn't been any visitors for weeks because of the drought. The footprints circled the RV once and then stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. When I showed them to Martin later, that day he didn't seem surprised at all. "They've been here before," he said cryptically. "Who?" I asked again. Martin just shook his head and muttered something about hollow children before walking away. Ellie spent most of that day drawing again. This time, her pictures showed children standing in water up to their knees, even though there wasn't any water left in Deadwood Creek. Their faces were blank except for their black eyes. I tried not to let it bother me too much. I mean, kids have wild imaginations sometimes, but something about those drawings made my stomach churn. That night was colder than usual for summer, unnaturally cold, and Rex wouldn't stop barking at nothing outside the RV window. Ellie woke up crying from a nightmare she couldn't explain but kept saying over and over again, "They're hungry." I didn't sleep much after that. The next few days at Deadwood Creek didn't get any easier. If anything, things got stranger. Ellie started talking about a new friend she made. At first, I thought she meant Martin, but when I asked her about it, she shook her head. "His name is Samuel," she said, her voice soft like she was telling me a secret. "He's a kid like me. He lives here." I frowned. "Ellie, there's no one else here except us and Martin." She just smiled in that way kids do when they think adults don't understand anything. "You can't see him, Dad, but he's nice." I didn't know what to say to that. Imaginary friends weren't unusual for kids her age, especially after everything we'd been through with losing her mom. Still, something about the way she said it made me uneasy. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I heard a sound. Outside the RV, like someone humming a song. It was faint at first, but as I sat up in bed and listened closer, it became clearer. It sounded like a child's voice singing an old-fashioned tune I didn't recognize. Rex started growling again, his ears flat against his head. Ellie was fast asleep in her bunk, but I could see her lips moving slightly, like she was mouthing the words to the same song. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to check things. Out. The air was freezing cold again, even though it had been sweltering during the day. The campground was pitch black except for the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" No answer. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. Then I saw them. Small footprints leading away from the RV toward the dried-up creek bed. They were fresh, too fresh to have been there earlier. I followed them for a few steps before stopping myself. Martin's warning echoed in my head. Don't go near the creek bed after sunset. My gut told me to turn back, so I did. The next morning, Ellie seemed fine, cheerful even, but when I looked at her drawings from the night before, my stomach dropped. She'd drawn more children standing around our RV this time. Their faces were blurry and distorted, but their eyes were still those, same black holes. "Ellie," I said carefully, trying not to sound scared, "why do you keep drawing these kids?" She looked up at me with wide eyes like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because they're here." Before I could ask her what she meant by that, we had a visitor, a woman named Donna Reeves. She showed up in an old Jeep with cameras slung over her shoulders and introduced herself as a wildlife photographer working on a project about droughts. Donna seemed friendly enough at first, talkative and curious about the area, but something about her felt off. She kept asking questions about the creek bed and its history, almost like she wasn't really here for wildlife at all. When I mentioned Martin's warning about staying away from the creek after dark, she just laughed nervously and said something about how old legends always have some truth to them. That evening, while Donna was setting up her camera gear near the edge of the campground, Ellie wandered off toward the creek bed without telling me. When I found her sitting on a rock near the dry stream bed, she wasn't alone. She was talking to someone, or at least it looked like she was talking to someone, but there was no one else there. "Ellie," I called out sharply. She turned to look at me with a startled expression. "What? Who are you talking to?" I asked as I grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the creek bed. "Samuel," she said simply. I didn't know what to say to that. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. That night was by far the worst one yet. Around 2 a.m., Rex started barking furiously at something outside the RV window. When I peered out into the darkness, my blood ran cold. The dead trees around our campsite looked closer than they had before, like they'd moved during the night without anyone noticing. And then there were those footprints again, circling the RV just like before, but this time stopping right outside Ellie's window. I didn't sleep all that night. By now, I was starting to feel like something wasn't right about Deadwood Creek. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier every day, like the valley itself was trying to keep us here. Ellie seemed fine on the surface. She laughed, she played with Rex, but her drawings kept getting darker. And Samuel, well, she talked about him more and more. I decided to ask Martin about the campground's history. He seemed to know a lot about this place, and I was desperate for answers. "Martin," I said when I visited his cabin one morning, "what's the deal with this place? Why do you keep warning me about the creek bed?" He sighed deeply and rubbed his beard like he was trying to decide how much to tell me. Finally he spoke. "This valley wasn't always like this," he said. Back in the early 1900s, there was a mining town here, Deadwood Village. It sat right where the creek is now. What happened to it? I asked. They flooded it, he replied. In 1933, they built a dam upstream to create a reservoir for the nearby city. The whole town was submerged. Why would they do that? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Martin looked at me with tired eyes. Because people started disappearing. I stared at him, waiting for him to explain. When he didn't, I pressed him further. What do you mean? Who disappeared? Children, he said quietly. Dozens of them over the years. They'd wander off into the woods or near the creek bed and never come back. The townsfolk thought it had something to do with the mines, like maybe there were hidden shafts or tunnels they fell into. But no one ever found them. I felt my stomach tighten as I remembered the footprints outside our RV and Ellie's drawings of children standing in water. After they flooded the valley, Martin continued, the disappearances stopped for a while, but every few decades people start reporting strange things again. Voices in the woods, footprints that don't belong to anyone living. Stuff like that. I didn't know what to say. It sounded like something out of a ghost story, but Martin wasn't the type to make things up. Why didn't you tell me all this sooner? I asked. You wouldn't have believed me, he said simply. That evening, Donna joined us for dinner at the RV. She seemed more interested in talking about the creek bed than eating, though. I found some old tribal markings near the edge of the valley today, she said excitedly. They were carved into rocks, symbols warning people not to go near the water. What kind of symbols? I asked. Donna pulled out her camera and showed me pictures of strange shapes carved into stone. Circles with jagged lines running through them and figures that looked like stick-figured children with hollow eyes. CTD, local tribes believed there was something evil tied to this place, she explained. An ancient spirit that feeds on grief and pain. Ellie perked up at that and said something that made my skin crawl. Samuel says it's not evil. It's just hungry. Donna froze and stared at Ellie like she'd just seen a ghost. Who's Samuel? She asked. Ellie shrugged casually. My friend. Donna didn't say anything after that, but her face went pale. Later that night, Ellie woke up screaming from another nightmare. When I ran to her bunk to comfort her, she clung to me tightly and whispered through tears. They're coming. Who's coming? I asked gently. She didn't answer. She just pointed toward her window with trembling fingers. When I looked outside, my heart nearly stopped. The dead trees looked even closer than before, like they were creeping toward us inch by inch while we slept. And then there were those footprints again. But this time, they weren't just outside. Ellie's window, they were everywhere around the RV. By this point, I was barely holding it together. Something was happening at Deadwood Creek, something I couldn't explain, and it was getting worse every day. Ellie's connection to her friend Samuel seemed to grow stronger, and the strange things around us were becoming impossible to ignore. That night, Donna disappeared. She had been staying in her Jeep near the edge of the campground. Around sunset, she told me she was going to take some photos of the creek bed before it got dark. I warned her not to go near it. Martin's words still fresh in my mind, but she just waved me off like I was being paranoid. She'll be fine, I told myself as I watched her walk off with her camera bag slung over her shoulder. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. When she didn't come back by nightfall, I started to worry. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the creek bed to look. For her. The air was colder than usual again, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Donna, I called out as I reached the edge of the dry creek bed. My voice echoed back at me, but there was no response. I shone my flashlight around and saw something glinting in the dirt a few feet away. It was Donna's camera. The strap was broken, and the lens was cracked like it had been dropped in a hurry. I picked it up and turned it on, hoping to find some clue about where she'd gone. The last few photos sent chills down my spine. They were blurry and dark, but I could make out shapes, small figures standing among the dead trees. Their faces were pale and waterlogged. their eyes black pits that seemed to stare right through me. I turned off the camera and ran back to the RV as fast as I could. When I got there, Ellie was sitting at the table with a blank piece of paper. In front of her, she wasn't drawing this time, just staring into space with a strange look on her face. "Ellie," I said gently as I sat down across from her. "Are you okay?" She looked up at me slowly, her eyes glassy like she wasn't fully awake. "They're here," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. Before I could ask what she meant, Rex started barking furiously at the door. His hackles were raised, and he looked more scared than I'd ever seen him. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and opened the door just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. They were there, just like in Donna's photos. Pale, childlike figures standing silently among the dead trees, their heads tilted at unnatural angles as if they were studying me. Their clothes were old-fashioned and soaked through with water that dripped onto the dry ground beneath them. One of them stepped forward, a little boy who couldn't have been older than 8 when he died. His face was bloated and gray. His mouth stretched into a wide grin that didn't reach his empty eyes. "Daddy?" Ellie's voice came from behind me, trembling with fear. I turned to look at her, but she wasn't talking to me. She was staring past me at one of the figures outside. "It's Samuel," she whispered. I slammed the door shut and locked it before pulling Ellie into my arms. "Stay here," I told her firmly. "Don't move." The next few hours felt like an eternity. The figures didn't try to break in. They just stood there, watching us through the windows with those empty black eyes. Every now and then, one of them would tap lightly on the glass or call out in a voice that sounded almost human, but not quite right. "Let us in," they whispered over and over again. "We're so hungry." Ellie clung to me tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered Samuel's name under her breath like a prayer. Rex barked until his voice went hoarse, but he wouldn't leave my side, not even for a second. When dawn finally came, they were gone, vanished like they'd never been there at all. But their footprints remained in the dirt outside, small, wet prints leading away from the RV toward the creek bed. I knew we couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was happening at Deadwood Creek wasn't going to stop. It was only going to get worse. I knew we couldn't stay at Deadwood Creek any longer. Whatever was happening here wasn't just some creepy coincidence. It was real, too real. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing up and driving away. Something about this valley felt like it was holding us here, like it didn't want us to leave. Ellie wasn't herself anymore. She spent most of the day sitting quietly, staring out the RV window toward the creek bed. Every now and then, she'd whisper Samuel's name or hum that strange old tune I'd heard the other night. It was like she was slipping further and further away from me. I decided to visit Martin one last time. If anyone could help us, it was him. When I got to his cabin, he was sitting on the porch with a shotgun resting across his lap. He looked older than ever, like the weight of this place had aged him overnight. "Martin," I said urgently, "I need answers. What's happening here? What are those things?" He didn't look surprised by my question, just tired. "They're not alive," he said simply. "Not anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're the children who disappeared," he explained slowly. "The ones who were lost before the valley was flooded. They're still here, trapped underground in the old mines beneath the creek bed." I felt a chill run down my spine. But why? Why are they coming after us? Martin sighed deeply and looked me in the eye. "Because they're hungry." "Hungry for what?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "For grief," he said quietly. "For pain. That's what keeps them alive. Or whatever you want to call it." I thought about Ellie and how much she'd been through since her mom died. Was that why Samuel had latched onto her? Because she was grieving. "Is there a way to stop them?" I asked desperately. Martin hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's no way to destroy them. not completely. But you can keep them away." "How?" I pressed. "Silver," he said firmly. "They can't touch it." I thought about our RV, the old silver shell that had been our home for years, and felt a flicker of hope. "But you need to act fast," Martin warned me. "A storm's coming tonight, a big one, and when the creek fills with water again, they'll be stronger than ever." That evening, as dark clouds rolled in over the valley, I prepared for what felt like a battle. I packed up everything we could carry and loaded it into the RV while Ellie sat quietly at the table with Rex by her side. She hadn't spoken much since this morning, but as I closed the door behind me, she looked up at me with wide eyes. "They don't want us to leave," she whispered. "I know," I said gently, kneeling down beside her, "but we have to." She nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. As night fell, the storm hit hard, rain pounding against the roof of the RV and thunder shaking the ground beneath us. The creek bed began to fill with water for the first time in years, and I could feel something shifting in the air around us. And then they came. The pale figures appeared again outside the windows, more of them this time, their faces twisted into unnatural smiles as they watched us from the darkness. Their voices echoed through the rain like whispers carried on the wind. "Don't leave," they begged softly. "Stay with us." Ellie started humming that tune again under her breath, her eyes glassy and distant. "Ellie," I said sharply, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her gently. "Stay with me. Don't listen to them." She blinked slowly and looked at me like she was waking up from a dream. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," I said, pulling her into a tight hug. "But we're going to get out of here, I promise." I started up the RV's engine just as one of the figures stepped forward and pressed its hand against Ellie's window. The glass frosted over instantly where its fingers touched, and Rex barked furiously at it from inside. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and drove straight toward higher ground, ignoring the figures that surrounded us on all sides. The silver shell of the RV seemed to keep them at bay. They couldn't touch it, but their voices followed us everywhere we went. "Come back," they whispered. "We're so hungry." As we climbed higher into the hills above Deadwood Creek, I glanced back at Ellie and saw tears streaming down her face. "It's Samuel," she said softly. "He doesn't want me to go." "You don't belong here," I told her firmly. "You belong with me." She nodded slowly but kept crying as we drove further away from the valley below. The rain came down in sheets as I drove the RV up the winding dirt road. The tires slipped and skidded on the muddy ground, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind us, the pale figures were still following. I couldn't see them clearly through the rain-splattered windows, but I knew they were there. I could feel them. Ellie sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching Rex tightly to her chest. She hadn't said a word since we left the campground, but her eyes kept darting toward the back window like she was afraid to look away. "They're getting closer," she finally whispered. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Dozens of them now, their pale faces glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved unnaturally fast, their limbs jerking and twisting as they ran after us. "Hold on!" I shouted as I pressed down harder on the gas pedal. The RV roared up the hill, but the road was getting steeper and more treacherous with every passing second. The storm wasn't helping either. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the valley below for just a moment. What I saw made my stomach drop. The creek bed was completely flooded now, water rushing through it like a raging river. And in that water, there were more of them. Their pale faces bobbed just above the surface, as they reached out with long, bony arms, clawing at nothing. "Dad," Ellie said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Samuel's here." I looked over at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the windshield. "He's waiting for us." I turned my eyes back to the road just in time to see a figure standing in the middle of it. A small boy, with gray skin and black eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He didn't move as we approached. He just stood there, staring. "Hang on," I shouted as I swerved to avoid him. The RV lurched violently to one side before skidding back, onto the road. Ellie screamed and Rex barked furiously as we narrowly avoided tumbling off the edge of the hill. When I looked back in the mirror again, Samuel was gone, but the others were still coming. We reached a flat clearing near the top of the hill just as the engine started sputtering. The RV groaned and shuddered before coming to a complete stop. No, 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 I muttered as I tried to restart it, but it was no use. We were stuck. They're here, Ellie whispered again. I turned to look out the window and felt my heart sink. The figures had surrounded us completely now, their pale faces pressed against the glass as they stared inside with those empty black eyes. "Let us in," they whispered in unison. "We're so hungry." Ellie clutched my arm tightly, her fingers digging into my skin. "Dad, what do we do?" I thought about what Martin had told me, that they couldn't touch Silver, and realized that our only chance was to stay inside the RV and hope it would be enough to keep them out. "We stay here," I said firmly. "They can't get in." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if it was true. The figures began tapping on the windows, softly at first, then harder and harder until it sounded like hailstones pelting against the glass. Their whispers grew louder too, filling the air around us like a swarm of insects. "Come with us," they begged. "Stay with us." Ellie covered her ears and started crying. "Make them stop." I grabbed her shoulders and looked her straight in the eye. "Ellie, listen to me. You have to fight this. Don't listen to them." She nodded shakily but kept crying as their voices grew louder still. And then everything went silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of rain pounding against the roof of the RV. The figures outside had stopped tapping on the windows and were just standing there motionless, staring at us. That's when I saw him again, Samuel, standing right outside Ellie's window this time. He raised one hand slowly and pressed it against the glass. Ellie gasped softly and reached out toward him like she was in a trance. "No!" I shouted as I grabbed her hand and pulled her back. "Don't touch him." "But he's my friend," she whispered tearfully. "He's not your friend," I snapped. "He's not even real." Samuel tilted his head slightly at that, as if he'd heard me, and then smiled that same eerie smile from before. The next thing I knew, there was a deafening crack of thunder followed by a blinding flash of lightning that lit up everything around us for just a second, and then they were gone. The figures outside had vanished completely. No footprints, no whispers, nothing. Ellie looked at me with wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What happened?" "I don't know," I admitted honestly as I pulled her into a tight hug. "But we're safe now." Or so I thought. We left Deadwood Creek first thing in the morning once the storm had passed. Ellie seemed quieter than usual during our drive back to town, but I figured she was just shaken up by everything that had happened. So was I. It wasn't until weeks later that I realized something wasn't right. One night while Ellie was asleep, in her room at our new apartment, I noticed something strange. Wet footprints leading from her bed to her window, and then stopping abruptly. When I checked on her, she was fast asleep, but clutched tightly in her hand was one of her old drawings from Deadwood Creek. Samuel standing among dead trees with his black eyes staring straight ahead. And then she started humming that tune again, the one from Deadwood Creek, the one that still haunts my dreams to this day. My name is Bobby Thornton, and if you're hearing this, it means I survived. But survival isn't always a blessing. Sometimes it's just a curse in disguise. It all started when my wife, Margaret, convinced me to take a family trip to Purgatory Pines, a remote state park in northern Michigan. She thought it would help me relax. "Clear your head," she said. "I'm a psychiatrist by profession, but lately I've been feeling like I'm the one who needs help. Burnout, nightmares, you name it." I hadn't been back to Purgatory Pines since I was a kid, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about going. Something about that place always felt wrong. The drive up there was uneventful. just miles of winding roads lined with towering pines and fiery autumn leaves. We were towing an old RV that Margaret's brother had lent us. A shiny 1972 GMC motorhome with panoramic windows and all the bells and whistles. It was supposed to be state-of-the-art, but from the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. The air was colder than it should have been, even with the heater running, and there was this faint smell of damp wood that wouldn't go away. Our twins, Kevin and Karen, were excited about the trip. Well, Karen was. She's the adventurous one, always looking for something new to explore. Kevin, on the other hand, is quieter, more cautious. He didn't say much during the drive, but kept glancing out the window like he was expecting to see something lurking in the trees. We arrived at Purgatory Pines just as the sun was setting. The park was eerily quiet. No other campers in sight despite it being peak fall season. The ranger station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Purgatory Pines State Park." An older man named Walter Jenkins greeted us with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You picked a good time to visit," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Not many folks come out here this late in the season." As we signed in, another woman entered the station, a younger Ojibwe woman named Diane Littlefeather. She worked there too, but seemed uneasy around us. She handed me a small bundle wrapped in red cloth and whispered, "Hang this inside your RV, for protection." Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away. Margaret laughed it off as local superstition and tossed the bundle onto the dashboard when we got back to the RV. But Kevin picked it up and stared at it like he could feel something coming off of it. "Dad," he said quietly, "do we really have to stay here?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to turn around and leave right then, but Margaret shot me a look that said we weren't going anywhere. We set up camp near one of the lakes, a massive body of water so still it looked like glass. The trees around it were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. As night fell, an unnatural chill settled over us. Even with all the windows closed and blankets piled high, we couldn't seem to get warm. That night was when things started to go wrong. I woke up gasping for air like I'd been underwater too long. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I looked around, I saw Margaret sitting up too, her face pale as a ghost. "Did you dream about drowning?" she asked. I nodded slowly. So did Kevin and Karen. None of us slept much after that. The next morning, as we stepped outside to stretch our legs, Karen pointed at one of the RV windows and said, "Look, there were tiny handprints on the frosted glass, too small to belong to any of us, and they were on the inside." Margaret tried wiping them away with her sleeve, but they wouldn't budge. I told myself there had to be an explanation, condensation or some kind of trick of light, but deep down, I knew better. As we stood there staring at those handprints, Diane appeared again out of nowhere. "You shouldn't have come back," she said softly. "Back?" I asked. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer directly, but gave me a look that sent chills down my spine. "You'll remember soon enough," she said before walking away again. That's when it hit me. The déjà vu. The lake. The trees. Even Diane's voice. It all felt familiar somehow. Like I'd been here before but couldn't quite put my finger on when or why. And then Walter's words from earlier came rushing back. It's him. The one who got away. Got away from what? I didn't know then. But I was about to find out. That first night at Purgatory Pines was colder than I expected. Even with the heater running full blast in the RV, it felt like the chill had seeped into my bones. Margaret wrapped herself in 2 blankets, and the twins huddled together in their sleeping bags. I kept telling myself it was just the weather. Nothing to worry about, but deep down, something didn't feel right. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I did, I dreamed about water. cold, dark water that pulled me under no matter how hard I tried to swim to the surface. It wasn't just a dream. It felt real. Too real. I could feel the weight of the water pressing down on my chest, hear the muffled echoes of voices calling my name from somewhere far away. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. Margaret was already sitting up beside me, her face pale and her hair sticking to her forehead. "You too?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "The water?" She nodded back. Before I could say anything else, Karen's voice cut through the silence from across the RV. "Dad? Mom? Did you dream about drowning too?" I turned to look at her and Kevin. They were both sitting up now, their faces pale as ours. Kevin looked shaken, like he'd just seen a ghost. "It was so cold," Karen whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. "I couldn't breathe." Kevin didn't say anything. He just stared out the window into the darkness outside. Margaret tried to brush it off as coincidence. "Maybe it's just because we're near the lake," she said, though her voice didn't sound convincing even to herself. "It's probably on our minds." But 4 people having the exact same dream? That wasn't normal. The rest of the night passed in silence. None of us dared to go back to sleep after that. The next morning, we stepped outside to get some fresh air and stretch our legs. The sky was a dull gray, and a thin layer of mist hung over the lake like a shroud. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a faint metallic tang that made me wrinkle my nose. Karen was the first to notice it. "Look," she said, pointing at one of the RV windows. There were handprints on the frosted glass, small handprints that didn't belong to any of us. They were too small for an adult but didn't match Kevin or Karen's hands either. And they weren't on the outside of the window. They were on the inside. Margaret grabbed a cloth from inside and tried wiping them away, but no matter how hard she scrubbed, they wouldn't budge. It was like they were etched into the glass. Somehow. "That's weird," she muttered under her breath. Kevin stayed quiet again, but he looked even more uneasy than before. Karen tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's a ghost," she said with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't laugh, neither did Margaret or Kevin. As we stood there staring at those handprints, Diane appeared out of nowhere again, just like she had at the ranger station yesterday. She moved so quietly I didn't even hear her coming until she spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," she said softly, looking straight at me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This place, it remembers." "Remembers what?" Margaret asked, stepping closer to me protectively. Diane didn't answer directly. Instead, she handed me another small bundle wrapped in red cloth, just like the one she'd given me yesterday at the station. "Keep this with you," she said firmly. "It won't stop everything, but it might help," before I could ask what she meant by everything. She turned and walked away again without another word. Margaret shook her head as we watched her disappear into the trees. "Superstitious nonsense," she muttered under her breath. But Kevin reached out and took the bundle from my hands before I could toss it aside like Margaret had done with the first one yesterday. He held on to it tightly like it was some kind of lifeline. "Maybe we should listen to her," he said quietly. Margaret opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw how serious he looked. Instead, she just sighed and walked back into the RV without saying anything else. Later that day, we decided to explore a little bit of Purgatory Pines while there was still daylight left. The park was eerily empty. Not another camper or hiker in sight despite it being peak fall season. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching through fallen leaves and an occasional bird call echoing through the trees. We followed a narrow trail that wound its way around one of the smaller lakes near our campsite. The water was so still it looked like glass, so clear you could see straight down to where tangled roots reached out like fingers beneath its surface. Karen ran ahead as usual while Kevin lagged behind with me and Margaret. At one point, Karen stopped suddenly and called, out to us from up ahead. "Hey, come look at this." When we caught up with her, we saw what had caught her attention. A small pile of stones stacked neatly on top of each other. A cairn, right by the edge of the lake. "That's weird," Margaret said as she crouched down for a closer look. "Who would build this all the way out here?" "There's more over there," Kevin said quietly, pointing further down along the shoreline where several more cairns stood in similar patterns, each one perfectly balanced despite their precarious positions on uneven ground. Something about them made my skin crawl, not because they were creepy on their own, but because they felt familiar somehow, like I'd seen them before but couldn't remember where or when. And then it hit me. Deja vu again. The same feeling I'd had yesterday when Diane warned us not to come back here. This place, it remembers. Her words echoed in my mind as I stared at those cairns by the lake, and for reasons I couldn't explain yet, I knew she was right. The next day started off quiet, but the uneasiness from the night before lingered like a shadow over all of us. Margaret tried to keep things normal by making pancakes on the tiny RV stove, but even she seemed distracted. Kevin barely touched his food, and Karen kept glancing out the window toward the lake. "Let's go for a walk," Margaret said after breakfast, trying to sound cheerful. "Fresh air will do us good." I agreed, hoping that getting out of the RV might help shake off whatever strange mood had settled over us. We decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The path was narrow, lined with towering pine trees that seemed to close in on us as we walked. The air was crisp and cold, and every step crunched loudly on fallen leaves. Karen ran ahead like she always did, her curiosity getting the better of her. Kevin stayed close to me, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Dad," he said quietly after a while, "do you feel like someone's watching us?" I stopped walking and looked around. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling he was right. "It's just your imagination," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Karen called out from up ahead. "Hey, come look at this." We hurried to catch up with her and found her standing by a small pile of stones stacked neatly on top of each other. A cairn, right near the edge of the lake. "Who do you think made this?" she asked, crouching down to get a closer look. Margaret frowned as she examined it. "Probably just some hikers," she said, though there was doubt in her voice. Kevin pointed further down the shoreline. "There's more." We followed his gaze and saw several more cairns scattered along the water's edge, each one perfectly balanced despite being made of uneven stones. They formed a strange pattern that seemed deliberate, though I couldn't quite figure out what it meant. Something about them made my stomach twist, not because they were creepy on their own, but because they felt familiar, like I'd seen them before but couldn't remember when or where. "Let's keep moving," I said quickly, not wanting to linger by the lake any longer than we had to. Back at the RV later that afternoon, I decided to check out the park's visitor center while Margaret stayed behind with the twins. The building was old and dusty, filled with faded maps and outdated brochures about hiking trails and fishing spots. In one corner, there was a small display case with black and white photos of Purgatory Pines from decades ago. As I scanned through them, one photo caught my eye, a group of children standing by one of the lakes. There were 7 of them, 6 boys and 1 girl, all smiling at the camera. Something about their faces tugged at my memory, but before I could figure out why, Walter Jenkins appeared behind me. "Recognize anyone?" he asked in his gravelly voice. I turned to face him. "No. Should I?" He gave me a strange look before nodding toward the photo. "That was taken in 1949, he said slowly. "The year those kids drowned." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" I asked. Walter hesitated for a moment before answering. "They were playing near the water when they fell in," he said carefully. "It was an accident." but something in his tone told me there was more to the story than he was letting on. As I stared at the photo again, another detail caught my attention. One of the boys was wearing a bracelet, a simple braided band made of red and blue thread. I froze. It looked exactly like a bracelet I'd had as a kid, the same one I'd lost years ago and never thought about since. That night, things got worse. We were all sitting around the tiny table in the RV playing cards when Karen suddenly stood up and walked to the window without saying a word. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Karen didn't answer right away. She just stood there, staring out into the darkness before finally whispering, "There's someone out there." Margaret and I exchanged uneasy glances before joining her at the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows under the moonlight. But then I noticed it, movement near the edge of the lake. It was faint, barely more than a ripple in the water, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Probably just an animal," Margaret said quickly, pulling Karen away from the window, but her voice betrayed her nervousness. Kevin didn't say anything. He just stared at his sister like he knew something she wasn't telling us. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up flipping through an old journal I'd found tucked away in one of my bags. A journal I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with messy handwriting that looked vaguely familiar but didn't quite feel like mine. One entry stood out. "We made a promise today. A blood pact by the lake. Michael says it means we'll be friends. Forever." Michael? The name sent a jolt through me like an electric shock. Why couldn't I remember him? As I read further, fragments of memories began surfacing. Flashes of laughter by the water. Voices calling my name. Cold hands pulling me under. I slammed the journal shut before I could read any more and shoved it back into my bag. Something wasn't right about this place, about me being here, and deep down, I knew it wasn't just coincidence that brought us back to Purgatory Pines after all these years. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was pounding and my chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on me. Margaret was already up, making coffee, in the tiny RV kitchen. She looked as tired as I felt. "Rough night?" I asked. She nodded. "I kept hearing things," she said quietly. "Scratching, like something was trying to get in." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd heard it too. Soft, almost rhythmic scratching against the RV walls, but I'd convinced myself it was just tree branches brushing against the metal. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The kids were unusually quiet that morning. Karen sat by the window, staring out at the lake with a faraway look in her eyes. Kevin was hunched over the table, drawing something in his notebook. He didn't look up when I sat down next to him. "What are you working on?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before sliding the notebook toward me. It was a drawing of the cairns we'd seen by the lake, but there was something different about them. In Kevin's drawing, the stones weren't just random piles, they formed a shape. A circle with strange symbols inside it. "Where did you see this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Kevin shrugged. "I don't know," he said quietly. "It just came to me." Margaret walked over and glanced at the drawing. "It's probably from one of those video games he plays," she said dismissively, but her tone was strained. I didn't press him any further, but something about that drawing stuck with me. It felt important, like a piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was trying to solve. Later that day, we decided to take another walk around the park. Margaret thought it would be good for all of us to get out of the RV for a while, and I agreed. The air inside felt heavy, like it was closing in on us. We followed a different trail this time, one that led deeper into the woods. The trees here were older, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was covered in moss and fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps. As we walked, Karen ran ahead again like she always did. But this time, When she called out for us to come see something, her voice sounded off. Not scared exactly, but not excited either. When we caught up with her, she was standing by an old wooden sign half buried in the dirt. The letters were faded and hard to read, but I could just make out what it said. Camp Blackwater, closed since 1949. Margaret frowned as she read it. "What kind of camp closes for over 70 years?" she asked. I didn't answer because my attention was drawn to something else, a rusted metal bracelet lying in the dirt near the sign. It looked exactly like the one from the photo at the visitor center, the same one I'd had as a kid. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, memories came flooding back. Fragments of a summer long. Ego. Laughter by the lake. Voices calling my name. And then, screaming. I dropped the bracelet like it had burned me and took a step back. "Bobby, are you okay?" Margaret asked, her voice full of concern. I'm fine," I lied, though my heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Karen picked up the bracelet and slipped it onto her wrist before I could stop her. "It fits perfectly," she said with a grin. "Take it. Off," I said quickly. Too quickly. Her smile faded as she looked at me in confusion. "Why?" "Just do it," I insisted. She hesitated for a moment before sliding it off and handing it back to me. I shoved it into my pocket without another word. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the RV table after dinner when Karen suddenly started humming a tune none of us recognized. It was soft and slow, almost like a lullaby, but there was something unsettling about it. "Where did you learn that song?" Margaret asked. Karen stopped humming and tilted her head like she was trying to remember. "I don't know," she said finally. "It just popped into my head." Kevin looked up from his notebook then, his face pale as he stared at his sister. "You were singing in your sleep last night," he said quietly. Margaret and I exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything. A few hours later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up again flipping through that old journal I'd found in my bag. The entries were disjointed, just fragments of thoughts and memories, but they painted a picture of something dark and terrible that had happened here, all those years ago. One entry stood out. They told me not to break the circle, but I did anyway. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of everything. The dreams, Diane's warnings, Kevin's drawings, Karen's song. And then there was that bracelet, the one from my childhood that had somehow found its way back to me after all these years. As much as I wanted to believe this was all just coincidence or some elaborate prank by the locals, deep down I knew better. This place wasn't just haunted, it remembered me. And whatever had happened here in 1949 wasn't finished yet. The next morning felt heavier than the others. The air was thick and cold, and the mist over the lake hadn't lifted. It clung to the trees like a blanket, muffling every sound. Even the birds were silent. Margaret tried to keep things normal by making toast and eggs, but none of us had much of an appetite. Karen sat by the window again, staring out at the lake like she was waiting for something. Kevin was quieter than usual, his notebook closed, and forgotten on the table. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something we couldn't stop even if we tried. Later that day, Diane showed up at our campsite again. She moved so quietly I didn't hear her until she was standing right behind me. "You need to leave," she said firmly. Margaret stepped out of the RV and frowned at her. "Excuse me?" Diane ignored her and looked straight at me. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "It's not safe." I sighed and rubbed my temples. "Look, I don't know what you think is going on here, but we're fine," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to myself. "No," Diane said sharply. "You're not fine." Margaret crossed her arms and glared at her. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Diane hesitated for a moment before answering. This place? It remembers him, she said, nodding toward me. And it wants him back. Margaret's expression softened as she looked at me in confusion. What is she talking about? I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain it. Not yet. Diane reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in red cloth, the same kind she'd given me before. This is your last chance, she said, holding it out. To me. Take this and leave. Before I could respond, Karen stepped out of the RV and walked straight toward Diane. I know you, she said softly. Diane froze, her eyes widening in surprise. What? Karen tilted her head like she was trying to remember something. I've seen you before. In my dreams. Margaret grabbed Karen's arm and pulled her back protectively. Don't be ridiculous, she said quickly. But Diane didn't laugh or dismiss it as nonsense. Instead, she looked at Karen with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear? Sadness? Pity? You need to keep them safe, Diane said quietly, before turning and walking away without another word. That night, everything came crashing down. We were sitting around the RV table after dinner when Karen suddenly stood up and walked to the window again. She pressed her hand against the glass and stared out into the darkness. They're here, she whispered. Margaret rushed over to her side. Who's here? She asked urgently. Karen didn't answer right away. She just kept staring out at the lake before finally saying, The ones from Dad's dreams. My heart stopped. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen turned to look at me then, her eyes wide and glassy like she was in some kind of trance. They're waiting for you, she said simply. Before I could respond, Kevin spoke up from behind me. She's right, he said quietly. I saw them too. Margaret looked at both of them like they'd lost their minds. This is ridiculous, she snapped. There's no one out there. But deep down, I knew they weren't lying. Not this time. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside into the cold night air. Margaret tried to stop me, but I shook my head. I need to see for myself, I said firmly. The mist over the lake was thicker than ever now, so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But as I walked closer to the water's edge, I saw them, shadows moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. At first, I thought they were people, maybe other campers or hikers, but as they got closer I realized they weren't human at all. Their forms were twisted and unnatural, like something that had been pulled apart and stitched back together wrong. Their faces were blank except for hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. And then I heard it. Laughter, soft and eerie like children playing far away, but there was no joy in it. It was cold, empty, malicious. I stumbled, back toward the RV as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat. When I got inside, Margaret grabbed my arm and demanded answers. What did you see? She asked frantically. I didn't know how to explain it, not without sounding crazy, but Karen answered for me. They're here for Dad, she said calmly. He broke their promise. Margaret turned to look at me, in shock. What is she talking about? I took a deep breath and tried to gather my thoughts before answering. When I was a kid, we made a pact by the lake. A blood pact, I admitted slowly, but I broke it. Margaret stared at me like I'd grown a second head. A blood pact? She repeated incredulously. I nodded reluctantly. We promised we'd be friends, forever. But when things went wrong, I ran. Karen tilted her head again like she was piecing something together in her mind. They drowned because of you, she said softly, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut because deep down, I knew she was right. That night was the longest of my life. The RV felt smaller than ever, like the walls were closing in on us. Margaret sat at the table, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. Kevin was drawing. Again, his pencil scratching against the paper in short, frantic strokes. Karen sat by the window, humming that eerie tune under her breath. I couldn't sit still. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. The hollow eyes, the twisted forms, and heard their laughter echoing in my head. I knew they were waiting for me. Margaret finally broke the silence. "We need to leave," she said firmly. "First thing in the morning." I shook my head. "We can't." "What do you mean we can't?" she snapped. "This place isn't safe." I took a deep breath and tried to explain. "It's not just about leaving," I said slowly. "They're not going to let us go." Margaret stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Who's they?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "The ones who drowned," I said quietly. Her face went pale as she looked at me in disbelief. "You're serious?" I nodded. Karen spoke up then, her voice calm and steady despite everything. "They want you to finish what you started," she said simply. Margaret turned to her in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Karen didn't answer right away. She just kept staring out the window before finally saying, "The circle." Kevin looked up from his drawing then and slid it across the table toward me. It was another picture of the cairns by the lake, but this time they were arranged in a perfect circle with strange symbols inside it. "They told me what it means," he said quietly. Margaret grabbed the drawing and stared at it like she was trying to make sense of it. "What does it mean?" she asked. Kevin hesitated before answering. "It's a doorway," he said softly. I didn't sleep at all that night, not that I could have even if I'd tried. As soon as the sun started to rise, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the lake. Margaret tried to stop me again, but I shook my head. "I need to end this," I said firmly. She wanted to argue but didn't. Instead, she just nodded and stayed behind with the kids. The mist over the lake was thicker than ever now. So thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But as I walked closer to the water's edge, I saw them again. Shadows moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. This time, they didn't stay hidden. They stepped out of the mist one by one, 7 of them in total, and formed a circle around me near the cairns. Their faces were blank except for those hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. And then one of them spoke. A boy with messy hair and a crooked smile that sent chills down my spine. "You broke your promise," he said simply. Swallowed hard and tried to find my voice. "I didn't mean to," I said weakly. The boy tilted his head like he was studying me. "You ran," he said accusingly. "I was scared," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my guilt. The boy didn't respond right away. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes before finally saying, "Finish what you started." I didn't know exactly what they wanted me to do, but deep down, I knew it had something to do with the circle. The cairns by the lake that Kevin had drawn over and over again. I crouched down and began rearranging the stones into a perfect circle like Kevin's drawings showed. My hands trembled as I worked, but I forced myself to keep going even as their laughter echoed around me like a cruel taunt. When I finished arranging the stones, I stood up and waited, but nothing happened right away. And then Karen appeared, behind me out of nowhere. "What are you doing here?" I asked frantically. She didn't answer right away. She just stepped into the circle without hesitation and knelt down beside one of the cairns. "They told me how to fix it," she said calmly. Before I could stop her, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in red cloth, the bundle Diane had given us earlier. She placed it in the center of the circle and whispered something under her breath. Words I couldn't understand, but felt strangely familiar. The air around us changed instantly, growing colder and heavier until it felt like we were underwater, even though we were standing on solid ground. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, again, everything was different. The mist had lifted, and the shadows were gone. The cairns were still there, but no longer felt threatening or ominous. They just looked like piles of stones now. Karen stood beside me, her face pale but calm as she looked out at the lake one last time before turning back toward the RV without saying a word. Margaret rushed out to meet us halfway back to camp, her face full of worry as she hugged Karen tightly before turning to me with tears in her eyes. "Is it over?" she asked desperately. I nodded slowly but didn't say anything, because deep down, I wasn't sure if it really was over or if we just bought ourselves more time.